I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to share my slides. Can I get someone to give me a thumbs up that you can all see that? Yeah, okay, perfect. So thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you everyone for coming to my talk on gendered performances in refugee status determination systems. My goal for this talk is to give you all an overview of my research, as part of a much longer paper on this topic, which is titled Gendered Performances, Dissecting Gender-Based Persecution in Refugee Status Determination. I am currently working with an editor for that paper, which should hopefully be published later this year. But I would love to hear your comments, questions, and feedback as I work through the editorial and revision process, so I can hopefully make the end product a clearer and better contribution to refugee studies literature. There we go. Now, before I go into the details of my talk, I just want to briefly acknowledge that I'm currently in Ottawa, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Ganyangihaga, and Omamwinawig peoples, who were and remain the traditional keepers of this land. So I already got a very lovely introduction, so I'll keep it briefer on this one. There we go. I am a first-year law student at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law, doing the JD program, as well as my MA in International Affairs at Carleton University. Before that, I was a student at McGill in Montreal, where I did my Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and International Development, with a focus on refugee and forced migration studies. Just as a very small plug, while I was at McGill, I had the opportunity to work as a research assistant with Professor Megan Bradley on her newest book, which is titled The International Organization for Migration, Commitments, Challenges, and Complexities. If you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, it has a strong focus on how the IOM works with Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, as well as the opportunities and challenges that come with refugees being serviced by IOM instead of UNHCR in that specific country context. So I want to start by briefly touching on the theoretical framework for my paper. There's a growing body of literature on refugee status determination systems, but for the most part, it remains a very opaque part of the bureaucratic structure of global North states. And what inspired my research were two books. The first is titled Points of Entry by Professor Vic Sateswich at McMaster University. He was granted special access to observe how Canadian immigration officers at embassies and consulates abroad make their decisions on who is admitted and who isn't. And the second book is Who is Worthy of Protection? Gender-Based Asylum and US Immigration Politics by Professor Meghana Nayak at Pace University. And so Professor Nayak had a really great analysis of the American refugee status determination system and how it intersects with gender. And my goal was to extend it into a more discursive analysis here. And those two books together really set the groundwork for my paper, which delves into the performative nature of gendered expectations of these RSD systems in the global North, using primarily a feminist and discursive lens of analysis. So in looking at the issue of gender in the global refugee regime, I'm sure we've all contended with the idea that the 1951 Refugee Convention lacks an explicit gender basis of persecution. I won't dwell on that too much, as there's much more literature than I could cover in 15 minutes that problematizes the exclusion of gender as a ground for refugee protection, but it's an important kind of first thing to note. And instead, I want to ask what happens when gendered experiences of persecution run up against the refugee status determination mechanisms that exist in almost all global North states. And so one of the most obvious things you might notice when reading the 1951 Refugee Convention is the gendered language in what defines persecution and what defines a refugee. I will set that aside for now because, again, there's a wealth of literature on the subject of gendered language in international legal agreements, in legal writing generally, and I don't want to take away from the focus of my talk today. But more substantively, the definition of a refugee given in Article 1 of the 1951 Refugee Convention focuses on outward demonstrations of identity and political belief that generally take place in the public sphere. Great Batch in 1989 writes that the public sphere is more easily navigable for men, leaving women and gender diverse refugees excluded. A seminal piece from Lisa Hunt in 2008 discusses the mobility of men versus women refugees and identifies women's traditional role in family social production as one of the barriers to being able to flee across state borders. Numerous scholars have problematized the construction of gender norms and gender roles in assigning responsibility for social production to women, and these effects are only highlighted among refugees. And then the third challenge I want to highlight to how the definition is framed in the 1951 Refugee Convention is that Vollmer and Karakayaki in 2018 write about the inverse relationship between asylum seekers' subjective deservingness of refugee protection and their agency to seek out the necessary protection from another state. So though one refugee's subjective deservingness may be greater, their individual capacity to seek out that protection is typically lower, and that's the inverse relationship that they write about. In their analysis, they found that women refugees typically have fewer material resources at their disposal to actually go about seeking refugee protection in a neighboring state, which significantly limits their agency. Now, none of these challenges are terribly surprising, but what I found most interesting was how these challenges play out when asylum seekers come into contact with the heavily bureaucratized and regulated refugee status determination systems of the global north. So Nyack, in her book, sets the groundwork for this analysis by advancing the autonomous worthy victim frame and the innocent worthy victim frame as two ideal types that global north refugee status determination systems have come to expect from refugees who arrive at their borders. The first expects refugees to demonstrate agency and self-help to overcome conditions of helplessness. And we see this as a recurring theme in much of international law more broadly, that the international legal system is considered a self-help system. And then the second frame desires refugees that are helpless and in need of assistance and rely on global north states to liberate them from these so-called oppressive conditions. And I should also say so-called to liberate in air quotes. So if it seems like the global north states are expecting refugees to fit neatly into one of these two patriarchal ideal type boxes that seem pretty contradictory in their nature, then I think you're on the right track, and that's the same conclusion that Nyack came to in her book. So what happens when refugees try to fit themselves into one of these two ideal types to better meet the expectations of the RSD institutions in the global north? I argue that it creates an expectation, particularly on women refugees, to reject their family and culture in order to distance themselves from what is perceived to be the source of their persecution. In performing this role, however, this creates feelings of alienation and isolation for refugees as they seek protection outside the boundaries of their home state. And I think Nesa touched on this quite nicely, on the feelings of alienation and isolation that refugees can experience. And indeed, the process of refugee status determination often centers on issues of alienation. Megan Casey writes that refugees often fare better in their refugee status hearings when the decision maker on the other side can construe the asylum seeker's culture as, quote, non-Western, inferior, and barbaric towards women. And the fact that those are the refugees that tend to fare better in their asylum hearings is deeply problematic and speaks to the essentialization of culture as well as the essentialization of gender. And so I argue that the expectation on women refugees to take this step of rejecting family and culture thrusts them into the public sphere, where their beliefs and behaviors are under close scrutiny of the administrative state in global north countries, in systems which are often not attuned to the need to be sensitive in how private sphere persecution and intra-family and intracultural persecution can occur. On the opposite end of the spectrum, refugees who are forced to perform to the expectations of the innocent worthy victim frame often find themselves artificially limiting their own agency. If you are aware of how refugee status determination hearings work, the credibility of the claimant is one of the determinative issues in a lot of claims. And so asylum seekers are in this catch-22 situation where they're expected to demonstrate that they've attempted some self-help approaches to resolve their situation. You can think of internal flight alternatives as one example, but they also have to demonstrate that that their only option left was to flee and to seek refugee protection. And so in order to ensure that their story of refugee flight appears credible, refugees then also have the added challenge of trying to fit into one of these two frames, these ideal type frames that Nayek discusses in her book. And this is particularly difficult for refugees who engage in sex work or who may use the services of smugglers to facilitate their transit across state borders. The effects of these gendered performances among refugees seeking the protection of global North states extends beyond just individual experiences in refugee status determination. As Nesa also touched on already, the role of media in producing and reproducing narratives of what an ideal type refugee looks like affects perceptions far beyond the borders of any one state. And though decision makers in Canada at the Immigration Refugee Board or other RSD systems in the global North do their best to apply the law as written, we understand from a socio-legal perspective that this is a very difficult thing to do, and that decision makers are influenced by what they see in the media and the representations that they see more broadly. So the centrality of persecution in popular portrayals of refugees privileges men who can operate in the public sphere with greater ease and reinforces the performative nature of gender in refugee status determination. I argue that this, at least in part, explains some of the global refugee flows and the significant gender imbalance that exists in current global refugee movements. And finally, I just want to acknowledge a few of the research limitations that I at least caught myself in my paper. If you see some yourself, please do let me know. The first is that I did focus solely on RSD systems in the global North. My hope is to engage more fully with how the global South states go about their own RSD processes, including by engaging the services of UNHCR in a future project. I also acknowledge that I did not capture the full spectrum of sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex identities of refugees. Jazz Dawson and Paula Gerber have a fantastic paper published in 2017 that I relied on heavily for my analysis and that I highly recommend you read if you want a really good picture of how Australia and New Zealand treat sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex refugee claimants. And then finally, one section of my paper that I did not get to present to you today deals with the empowerment narratives that exist under the performative framework of gender and refugee status determination. Because there are certainly refugees who are able to exercise greater agency in the context of the current system. That was a separate part of my current paper, but I didn't want to present that today, just in the interest of time. And so with that, I'll conclude there. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and for listening. And I look forward to hearing your questions and the discussion with the other panelists.